Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel. Thank you for joining me today as we continue our film reviews with an Old World Tartaria film review of Metropolis, the channel's first in-depth film review of Fritz Lang's classic masterpiece, a pioneering science fiction film and one of the last great films of the silent era. So, in the interest of understanding what my perception is in viewing this film, I grew up a fan of science fiction films and TV series, and that includes everything, not just limited to Star Wars, Star Trek, or Doctor Who. I certainly watched all three of those and am well aware of them. I'd never seen Metropolis before. In fact, prior to viewing the film for this review, the oldest film I had watched was a film called Northwest Passage, a 1940 film starring Spencer Tracy, set during the 7 Years' War, what's also called the French Indian War. So, very different film, very different genre. I'd only seen scenes from silent films before. I'd never watched an entire silent film all the way through from start to finish. So this was the first time I had that experience. So I think that's important to keep in mind when you're listening to this review, what my perception is. And one thing to remember about silent films is they relied entirely on the expression of the characters, the framing of the scenes. There was no dialogue. You couldn't get any kind of tone or any sort of inflection within the voices. They just didn't have it because they didn't speak. So they relied on a different means of conveying a message in the film. It's important to keep that in mind through the review, and it's also important to keep that in mind if you opt to watch this movie, because there are some ways that this movie can be extremely dazzling, and it contains some scenes that are just difficult to explain because we're not used to watching these kind of films. Films have changed a lot even over the last 40 years. Just the genre and the themes, while they may seem to be the same, the method of telling a story has changed. So let's look at Metropolis. There will be spoilers in this review, so if you want to watch the film prior to watching the review, I encourage you to do so, but we need to understand the film, how it was made, what the plot is, before we look into a review. Metropolis is a 1927 German expressionist science fiction film directed by Fritz Lang and written by Thea von Harbo in collaboration with Lang from von Harbo's 1925 novel of the same name, which was intentionally written as a treatment. So it sounds very similar to the story of how 2001, another pioneering science fiction film that would come out well over 40 years after this with Stanley Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke. It stars Gustav Froelich, Alfred Abel, Rudolf Klein-Roeg, and Bridget Helm. Eric Pomer produced it in the Babelsberg Studios for Universum Film. The silent film is regarded as a pioneering science fiction movie, being among the first feature-length movies of that genre. Filming took place over 17 months in 1925 to 1926 at a cost of more than 5 million Reichsmarks, or the equivalent of about 21 million euros. Now, they say that that's how much it would cost today, which I find interesting because when we look at some of the images from this film, 21 million euros right now at the exchange rate, probably about 22, close to $23 million. It seems like they made this at a bargain. So who knows what it actually cost to make, because again, that's something else that can be obscured over time, and we're looking at a movie that's already almost 100 years old. Made in Germany during the Weimar period, and for those who aren't familiar with it, the Weimar period is the interwar period between World War I, the rule of the Kaiser, and World War II, the National Socialist regime in Germany. Metropolis is set in a futuristic urban dystopia and follows the attempts of Freder, the wealthy son of the city master, and Maria, a saintly figure to the workers, to overcome the vast gulf separating the classes in their city and bring the workers together with Fredersen, the city master. The film's message is encompassed in the final intertitle: the mediator between the head and the hands must be the heart. Metropolis met mixed reception upon release. Critics found it visually beautiful and powerful. The film's art direction, along with the touches of the Gothic in the scenes in the catacombs, the cathedral, and Rotwang's house, so very interesting, the scenes that we already have described, and lauded its complex special effects, but accused its story of being naive. H.G. Wells described the film as silly, and the Encyclopedia of Science Fiction calls the story trite and its politics ludicrously simplistic. Its alleged communist message was also criticized. Interesting that H.G. Wells was a discerned critic of the film, especially given the fact as to how he viewed class conflict with his view of the Morlocks and so forth from his story The Time Machine. So apparently someone trying a different thing, trying to tell a different story, didn't appeal to him. So according to this account, it seems that how we viewed things with our perceptions has always been with us. Not a surprise. The film's long running time also came in for criticism. It was cut substantially after its German premiere. Many attempts have been made since the 1970s to restore the film. In 1984, Italian music producer Giorgio Moroder released a truncated version with a soundtrack by rock artists including Freddie Mercury, Loverboy, and Adam Ant. Boy, talk about bringing a movie to the contemporary frame. In 2001, a new reconstruction of Metropolis was shown at the Berlin Film Festival. In 2008, a damaged print of Lang's original cut of the film was found in a museum in Argentina. To quote the opening explanation of the restored film, the material was heavily damaged and, because it had been printed on 16mm film stock, does not have the full aperture silent picture ratio. In order to maintain the scale of the restored footage, the missing portion of the frame appears black. Black frames indicate points at which footage is still lost. After a long restoration process that required additional materials provided by a print from New Zealand, the film was 95% restored and shown on large screens in Berlin and Frankfurt simultaneously on 12 February 2010. Metropolis is now widely regarded as one of the greatest and most influential films ever made, ranking 35th in a poll. In 2001, the film was inscribed on UNESCO's Memory of the World Register, the first film thus distinguished. On New Year's Day 2023, the film's United States copyright expired, entering the public domain in that country. So quite a legacy with this film, and it's interesting to consider the fact that this film has been altered so many times, has been changed so many times, and of course that's something that even more modern films, we'll just refer to Star Wars, have come under criticism for how much the film has been changed from its original vision or modified as different technology, different times become available. It seems to be something that happens a lot with science fiction films. Now let's take a look at the plot. In the future, wealthy industrialists and business magnates and their top employees reign over the city of Metropolis from colossal skyscrapers, while underground-dwelling workers toil to operate the great machines that power it. Fredersen is the city's master. His son Freder idles away his time at sports and in a pleasure garden, but is interrupted by the arrival of a young woman named Maria, who has brought a group of workers' children to witness the lifestyle of their rich brothers. Maria and the children are ushered away, but Freder becomes fascinated by her and goes to the lower levels to find her. In the machine halls, he witnesses the explosion of a huge machine that kills and injures numerous workers. Freder has a hallucination that the machine is a temple of Moloch and the workers are being fed to it. When the hallucination ends and he sees the dead workers being carried away on stretchers, he hurries to tell his father about the accident. Groot, the foreman of the heart machine, brings Fredersen secret maps found on the dead workers. Fredersen fires his assistant Josaphat for not being the first to bring him details about the explosion or the maps. After seeing his father's cold indifference towards the harsh conditions faced by the workers, Freder secretly rebels against him by deciding to help the workers. He enlists Josaphat's assistance and returns to the machine halls, where he trades places with a worker who has collapsed from exhaustion. Fredersen takes the maps to the inventor Rotwang to learn their meaning. Rotwang has been in love with a woman named Hel, who left him to marry Fredersen and later died giving birth to Freder. Rotwang shows Fredersen a robot he has built to resurrect Hel. The maps show a network of catacombs beneath Metropolis, and the two men go to investigate. They eavesdrop on a gathering of workers, including Freder. Maria addresses them, prophesizing the arrival of a mediator who can bring the working and ruling classes together. Freder believes he can fill the role and declares his love for Maria. Fredersen orders Rotwang to give Maria's likeness to the robot so that it can discredit her among the workers, but is unaware that Rotwang plans to use the robot to destroy Metropolis and ruin both Fredersen and Freder. Rotwang kidnaps Maria, transfers her likeness to the robot, then sends the robot to Fredersen. Freder finds the two embracing and, believing it is the real Maria, falls into a prolonged delirium. Intercut with his hallucinations, the false Maria unleashes chaos through Metropolis, driving men to murder and stirring dissent among the workers. Freder recovers and returns to the catacombs, accompanied by Josaphat. Finding the false Maria urging the workers to rise up and destroy the machines, he accuses her of not being the real Maria. The workers follow the false Maria from their city to the machine halls, leaving their children behind. They destroy the machines, triggering a flood in their city deeper underground. The real Maria, having escaped from Rotwang's house, rescues the children with help from Freder and Josaphat. Grot berates the celebrating workers for abandoning their children in the flooding city. Believing their children to be dead, the historical workers capture the false Maria and burn her at the stake. A horrified Freder watches, not understand the deception until the fire reveals her to be a robot. Rotwang becomes delusional, seeing the real Maria as his lost Hel, and chases her to the roof of the cathedral, pursued by Freder. The two men fight as Fredersen and the workers watch from the street, and Rotwang falls to his death. Freder fulfills his role as mediator by linking the hands of Fredersen and Grot to bring them together. So that's the plot. Definitely something contemporary from that time, but yet we have so many allusions and so many elements of the plot that could be referring to other things that we're going to look at in detail when we look at stills from the film. Also, something else to note. Apparently, Fritz Lang, who's an Austrian filmmaker, although this is a German film, went to the United States with the rule of the National Socialists, and Thea von Harbou stayed within Germany. And it seems as though her career was suppressed. And while she took part in films, it appears that many of those films were supportive of that regime that ruled Germany from the 1940s. So it's interesting how her career really seemed to only be a highlight with this movie. And it's as though she sort of faded into obscurity afterwards, despite apparently having immense talent and being able to bring about this kind of plot. So not sure, we really don't know. Remember that this is from over 100 years ago when a lot of this was developed and filmed. So that's something we need to keep in mind as we look at the stills and analyze the film in more depth. It has been suggested that Metropolis could very well be a film, or at least material from Metropolis was something from the Old World, Tartaria, the previous civilization, whatever you want to call it. And on this channel, I do use the term Tartaria because that's the easy search term, but we have no idea what the civilization that preceded ours was called. And it's just important to keep in mind. One of the reasons I lamented the fact that Lang and von Harbou were unable to collaborate more, their relationship deteriorated after making this film, and they were a married couple and then divorced, is that if they did create this film, it's a brilliant film. It stands out in many different ways. And as we go through the images, you'll see that it no doubt inspired essentially all the science fiction films throughout the entire 20th century and leading to today. I think it's important to remember that what we see was made at a time, and they do have production stills. They do show pictures of making these amazing sets, but it's still almost otherworldly, and you'll see that. Now, the film begins soon after its premiere. They remind you that they don't even have the full film. It was chopped to pieces. It's been edited, modified. They did the 80s rock version with Adam Ant providing the soundtrack. Oh, I don't know if I'd ever want to see that. Nothing against Adam Ant. It's just, when you mix genres and time frames, things get really confusing. But they remind you the material was heavily damaged, and because it had been printed on 16mm film stock, they don't have the full aperture silent picture ratio. So film has been modified at the end of the day. Black frames indicate points at which footage is still lost. So it's just important to remember that this film has been heavily modified. What was the original intention if this was a film that was made in the 20s, as we believe, or as we may not believe? We do know that it has been changed, and they're telling us that it's been changed. The film opens with this scene of the clock. And one thing that a lot of researchers have commented on is that this is a 10-hour clock. 10-hour clock perhaps representing a different civilization that counted time in a different way. However, the movie and the plot specifies that the 10-hour clock is for the workers who work underground, and the 24-hour clock above it represents regular time for the masters and planners of the city who live above ground. Both interpretations are valid. My interpretation is that it's something much more insidious. What this opening scene is showing us is how time can be controlled, how the perception of time can be changed. For the workers, 10 hours, they believe it's 10 hours and they're getting a good deal. They're only having to work 10 hours. But in reality, the 10 hours of their shift are actually 12 hours counted on the clock above. And that's potentially because every minute in worker time on the 10-hour clock is really 72 seconds a minute, as opposed to the standard 60 seconds a minute in the city master's clock. For me, it's more of an interesting perception that if you can control time, you can control how people see the world, and you can also control how people function in the world. I think that's what it's alluding to. Now, it's not to say that I discount the theory that this could be a clock from some other civilization, but I believe that's more of a valid point, and It's more of a terrifying point to me because it shows a manner in which time can be controlled. And of course, we open up with an amazing cityscape photo. We've got the bells and the whistles going off, indicating what's supposed to be a shift change, indicated by the black card that tells us what's going on, as this is a silent movie. And we see the shift change. Now, what's really remarkable is that if you view this film and you go off of the plot and you go off of the intercut cards that tells you what's going on, there's an entirely other way that you can view this film, this being a silent film. You can completely ignore what the cards are telling you, and you can just look at the scenes and develop your own meanings for the scenes. It's really that easy to do. I'm sure you've seen plenty of recut episodes of Star Trek or other movies that people have done on YouTube over the years, and that's footage that even has dialogue, and yet they're able to recut that dialogue and make coherent scenes. Well, just imagine this. All you have are these title cards that tells you what the plot narrative is. All you have is a lot of imagery. So in this imagery, we're told that these are workers going underground to work, and that this is a shift change. But it could have different meanings to it. We could also see this as people who are being herded underground. Again, we have this meaning that people are being moved underground, and the imagery supports that. And of course, it's just a procession, an amazing set here that you see with some of the details built out. And again, this is a complete set. And still, when I look at the budget of this movie, I'm just amazed, especially when we see some of the images going forward. But this is remarkable because all these extras, supposedly, being moved to what is a shift change. Or it could represent people being moved underground, some other people being released from the underground. Many different ways to look at it. And of course, they get on this big elevator, and it's a long, long ride down deep in the underground. And interestingly enough, the film does an amazing job of showing you their journey underground, and you see that there's an entire underground city, which is a remarkable concept in and of itself, and it's something that we encounter in many theories of the old world about how previous existing populations were herded or shepherded underground. And here we see a depiction of this in the movie Metropolis, science fiction movie. But is it depicting something in the future or depicting something in the past? They arrive, and again, just look at this amazing set, the elevator and the build out of the set. And all this was done practically. These sets were built. There was no special effects. This was 1925, 1926 when they filmed the majority of this. But again, you're left with this image of what we're told are workers, but these could just be people who are being completely controlled and brought to the underground, a place they may not want to be. And again, just the impressive aspect of the set. This is the underground city as the workers are going towards their daily routine, their 10-hour, really 12-hour day, if we go off of what the clock shows us. And could it represent something else? Yes, absolutely. This could represent just a group of people being brought to live underground for a long period of time or for the rest of their lives. Again, images, scenes, but no dialogue. We contrast that unfortunate scene of people being herded underground to how people on the surface live. And we see an amazing, remarkable building, remarkable architecture. And this is supposed to represent the city controllers, masters of the city, if you will, the planners, and their society, which is a beautiful society. They live above ground. They have all the access and the privileges. Could this be representing something else? Could this be representing what society could be if people worked together and if we had a true understanding of society and we were able to reach to its greatest heights? Yes, it could represent that as well. This could represent what life can be, or it could indeed be a contrast to what we saw in the scene before. It's beautiful, and it depicts just enjoying yourself in leisurely activities on a beautiful day. We also see, and this is a very interesting scene, this group of city planners, how they live in what's a major city garden. Now, here's what's interesting to me is that the plants in this garden, I've never seen anything like this. I don't know if this was just supposed to be a science fiction imagining or some sort of creative view as to what the world could be or what they could do with gardens, but I've never seen plants or anything like this except in the Voynich manuscript. That's the only place I've ever seen where you have anything that looks like what's depicted in the scene. So I'm not sure what they're saying here. I'm not sure where their inspiration came from for filming this, but again, it's an amazing set, and it does give you the concept that this is taking place on another world, or perhaps a different world. So you can see why, as we go through the scenes, people could think that there are some very unique aspects to this movie, and it's quite remarkable. And of course, we have the courting scene of Freder, the son of the master of the city, and he's enjoying his high society life and the intention of many potential spouses trying to gain his attention. But look at the costumes, and one thing we'll pay attention to going forward is just some of the expressions that we see on faces in this movie. Now, we know this is a silent film, so everything's dependent on the expression of the faces, how they could frame a scene. They didn't have dialogue, they couldn't rely on tone and inflection in the voice, so they just had to go with all imagery. This is very interesting because this is where Maria just shows up at this garden, and supposedly with her are children of the workers below ground. But it's fascinating that we have just a group of many children who have no parents with them, and just one saintly adult figure who's conducting them around. And according to the plot, it's said that she brings this group of children to see their quote-unquote brothers, the city masters planners who live above ground. This could definitely be representing many other things, though. This could be representing one surviving adult bringing a group of children underground back to the surface. And we've seen that theory, and that's come up a lot. And here it is in imagery. So it's something we have to keep in mind. And a close-up of Maria again with all these children. I mean, when you think of the plot, it's interesting that all the workers would just be all right with their children being conducted around by this woman, albeit this is a woman that they respect, that she is supposedly a voice of the workers. Although one of the plot threads that comes up later is how the workers are so focused on what they have to do to keep the city running that they don't pay attention to their children, and this is why they're running off on their own. But could this have many different meanings? Absolutely. It's an image. Take it for what it is. Of course, Freder is just enamored with her, and one thing to pay attention to about this is just what you get in the eyes. It's almost as though there's some filmmaking technique or some manner of depicting this that shows amazing detail in the eyes. And we'll keep that in mind as we go forward. And of course, Maria has probably the most striking eyes through the movie, and that is most certainly by design. And her eyes go through many different variations that we'll see. She is the saintly figure of humanity, and yet at the same time, you see later in the plot what happens to her and how that can be subverted. And of course, the city authorities conduct her and the children away. They're not allowed to be on the surface, and that's what this represents. And again, looking at this garden, just amazing, almost science fiction plants on an alien world. And again, the only place I've seen anything like this is in other science fiction films or looking at the Voynich manuscript. So very inspired creativity. Or is this representing something that somebody saw in the past and they wanted to put in this film? That's entirely possible too. Now we go back to the underground and some amazing sets here that were fully built out. Just the size of these sets is remarkable. And the imagination to depict this, what are we looking at? Are we looking at the underground of this amazing city, Metropolis, or are we looking at something else that's representing of what may have existed? We don't know for sure. Could this even be footage from some other world or some other time? Anything's possible. But whether it was inspired or whether it's a direct film, it is remarkable to consider that looking at this footage. And here is one of the main machines and another very impressive set that was fully built out. Here you have workers on what is apparently a set operating this machine. And this is one of the critical scenes of the film that really sets up the plot that occurs right here with this machine. And you see how the workers toil away doing their 10, actually 12-hour days according to the plot. And it's just incessant work, and they're barely able to maintain their workload. Now, interestingly enough, the machine transforms into what appears to be a giant monster, and you do have this term thrown in, Moloch, although it should be noted that this is thrown in a title card. So is this really Moloch? Well, according to the title card and the plot of the film, it is. And it is interesting when you think about the fact that these workers, and this is an image from Freder, the son of Frederson, supposedly being sacrificed to Moloch. And of course, you have the high priests of Moloch, and these poor workers are just being sacrificed into the giant mouth here of Moloch. It's interesting symbolism, and it definitely has a lot of different meanings to it. Now, of course, the main plot will just say this is Freder seeing how these workers are treated, but this could have other meanings. We've looked on this channel about what happens underground and how people were sacrificed. There's also the recurring theme, whether it be in myth or theology, about how when human beings go underground, terrible things tend to happen to them. Well, you see that theme reflected in this movie. So after witnessing this, and what happens from Freder's point of view is that it's merely an accident and many of the workers are killed, but he sees it as Moloch and the workers being sacrificed to Moloch. He decides to go talk to his father, Fredersen. And Fredersen, who is the city master, operates in this amazing building called the New Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel is a very important plot piece in this movie, and it's part of its imagery. But just look at these amazing buildings. You even have aircraft. There are airplanes depicted, although this looks a lot more futuristic than that. It's just remarkable. Supposedly, Fritz Lang was inspired by a trip to New York City in the 1920s, and we know that New York in the 1920s looked a lot different. In any event, it's an amazing image, and the New Tower of Babel is definitely one of the most powerful images of buildings from this movie, but there are many more. And this is the amazing office layout that you see, and again, just another remarkable set with the detail that was put into it and giving you the idea of something that's very futuristic. And another recurring theme is the large doors, and you see that in many different scenes and many different sets throughout the movie. This is incredibly beautiful, this juxtaposition of different types of buildings. And when you look and study at this photo very carefully, you see everything from brutalist architecture to supposedly this film was inspired by the Art Deco. And remember that Art Deco, that building style, was big in the 1920s, although we have plenty of examples of buildings that were built well before the 1920s that displayed the Art Deco style. One of the big examples I've come across was Kansas City Union Station. But when you look at this imagery, it's just remarkable. I mean, this is really where we see so much of the imagery that inspired the creative science fiction scenes in all of our favorite science fiction movies from the second half of the 20th century to today. And it looks like here you have the New Tower of Babel and how it lays out in the center of the city. And this is a juxtaposed scene where you've got many different buildings working together. Quite amazing. Also, something you could consider an urban nightmare, inspiring and disturbing all at the same time. Another view of the New Tower of Babel, looking at it from the top down and just giving you an idea of its intricacy and all the detail that went into building it. These aren't the block, glass, and steel skyscrapers that we see now that are so prevalent in the late 20th and 21st century. This is something of a completely different design that's inspired and remarkable. And just looking at it, you can get that context from it. Other imagery in the movie, we just have amazing monuments and amazing views of how humanity functions and appreciates itself. One of the contrasting aspects in this movie, whether you take its plot at face value or you think it's a different plot, is you understand the dynamics between humanity. And the fact that they refer to the Tower of Babel, which it's not just the cards, you see iteration of the Tower of Babel. And of course we come to the robot that's factored primarily in the plot. And not looking at the plot, I just want you to look at the imagery that you see in this scene alone. And you can look at the robot and what it represents, a changing of humanity, humanity becoming automatic or an automaton species, if you will. Of course, you can't help but notice the symbol right above it and what that could potentially represent. And going in closer, just an amazing image and something that had never been seen before in the 1920s with the imagery of the robot. It looks lifelike, and yet at the same time, I'm sure you can see what, I'll just say, droid it inspired in a certain 1970s blockbuster science fiction movie. In any event, when you think about this, there is something disturbingly lifelike about this robot, and yet at the same time, it's artificial. It's an amazing amalgamation, and it hints towards the threat that humanity could be facing, not just in automatons themselves, but how humanity can become automatic. That's how I choose to interpret this imagery. And of course, we go back to the clock, and Freder trying to save or help the workers, and this is an analogy, but at the same time, this could represent how the perception of time is different and how time is controlled, and understanding that. One of the easiest ways to escape being controlled is to have your own perceptions, because if your perceptions go along with the forces that are trying to control you, well, their reality becomes your reality, and this reflects that. The Tower of Babel. This is a major plot point in the movie, and the imagery that we see reflects that, and the story of the Tower of Babel. And we'll look at that in the conclusions as to why that is so important, also for considering this from an Old World and Tartarian legends perspective. Of course, we have vast groups of people to the Tower of Babel story that the creators had this amazing idea, but building out this idea was difficult for the people. And here's one of the title blocks. Now, again, we don't know if this was inserted later in the footage or what, but the hands that built the Tower of Babel knew nothing of the dream of the brain that had conceived it. And of course, they show the imagery of the Tower of Babel, the dream that conceived it. And then they show people hauling a very, very large block that looks like it could be on its way to the Temple of Baalbek. How people could move that is completely beyond imagination, but they do show an image of it, of thousands of people toiling away to move the blocks in place to build the Tower of Babel. And of course, a reference, great is the world and its creator. Just remarkable, though. And they show the Tower of Babel collapsed. And remember that in the movie we feature the new Tower of Babel. That is where Fredersen, the city master's headquarters, is. Now we go back to this image of Maria, and you can see the eyes changing quite a bit, as though she's lost some of her autonomy. She looks as though she's in a bit of a trance, and that goes along with the image of the robot. You look at the robot, and you have to juxtapose the trance that Maria's in with the robot. There's more than what's going on with the plot. I believe this represents a threat to humanity and how we can simply become lockstep and simply following whatever authority tells us without ever even asking questions. It's how I choose to interpret what the movie's imagery is telling us. Now, could this be something else? Absolutely. Could it just be the plot of the movie? Yes, it could be. This is another powerful scene from the movie, and this is where we see the essence of Maria being transferred to the robot. And again, this could represent other aspects just by the imagery alone. Perhaps surrendering our spirits, our souls, or even our autonomy and self-reliance to machines and to others simply because it's easier. Many different interpretations of it. This is one of the most iconic scenes in the movie in addition to the building imagery, and here is where you get this really, really strange aspect with the eyes. I don't know how they did this. I don't know how this was achieved or what this really represented, because when you look at these eyes, it's almost like they achieved a cat-like eye effect. Narrow slits, and you look at all the other eyes, and it's just a remarkable, disturbing scene all at the same time. I don't know if this was some technique of filmmaking. They just used context. They used a little bit of everything. It's possible. Could it represent something else? Yes. Could it represent how people become changed and succumb to their more base desires? Absolutely. It's incredible, though, however you look at it. And it's a disturbing scene, especially in the way that it's framed and in the fact that it shows you every expression. And you see human suffering, you see human righteousness and indignation. And it's easy to see what this can lead to. And yet another image of the eyes of Maria. And here you have a contrasting image where you see them bright and yet depicting so much character. And again, I'm not sure how they achieve this. It's an amazing effect, and certainly open to theories in the comments. And I would love to hear what you have to say, what you think these pictures of the eyes represent. And we have Maria going back down to encourage the workers for the revolt, or the robot. And the workers begin their revolt. And this is an interesting machine, the Heart Machine, another amazing set, and something that could represent other technology, we're not sure, or it could just simply be what it is in the movie. And then, of course, we get our flood that's caused by the workers sabotaging the machine. Now, the flood is a remarkable scene. And they show it completely destroying the underground city. Another question is, why would they have an underground city if the workers live above ground? Why would they be doing the shift change? It was something I was thinking about as I was watching it. But nevertheless, the underground city and the people who clearly seem to reside there because the children are brought up from the underground. That's kind of a contradiction in the story, but nevertheless, we have a flood and it destroys the underground. And of course, you have the workers trying to escape and the terror that they face. This is interesting because this is part of the cathedral, I believe, if I remember correctly. And some of the imagery of ghouls on the cathedral are quite remarkable. And then, of course, we have a vast group of people approaching cathedral. Amazing set again. Look at this arch and the doors. And, I mean, no detail spared. Just remarkable. And then all the extras approaching this. And then, of course, we're coming to the end of the movie where we have the main plot resolved, and we find out that the mediator, who is Freder, the son of Frederson, which is also an interesting alternative to how names typically work, between head and hands must be the heart. And then the final scene, where we have the city master and the spokesperson of the workers being brought together by Freder. That's what the plot tells us. But could this image mean something else? Yes, there is also the concept of the Trinity. It's easy to see how our society, and even the societies that preceded ours, at least in the history that we read, are totally obsessed with the concept of duality and polarized duality. There's always two sides, there's never more. What's interesting about this movie is that this depicts three sides, a balance, a trinity. It's definitely remarkable, and it's all part of the imagery in this movie. I highly encourage you to watch this movie and draw your own opinions and perceptions of it. It is a remarkable movie. You've never seen anything like it because the imagery is just something that does not match what we see in current movies. Yes, it requires a little bit of patience and understanding that you're watching a different movie from a different time, but there could be other meanings from it. It could represent something else that happened or different perceptions at a different time. Or it could genuinely be footage from a different time. We don't know for sure. We know it's well documented, and we know that the people that made the movie, those who starred in it, those who produced it and wrote it, were real people. But of course, we always know that history is questionable, even as early as the 1980s with some of the things that we've looked at, such as the Chronicle of Georgia and amazing buildings that were built in certain environments. So it's hard to say. I encourage you to make your own judgments, and I'll give you my conclusions in a moment. So what conclusions and theories do we have about Metropolis? There's a couple points I'd like to go over. First and foremost, the visuals and the eyes. There are incredible visuals of remarkable buildings, and there are also incredible visuals of people. These represent a different society, a different civilization. Now, whether this is merely a science fiction concept or this was actual footage representing something, it remains to be seen. The Tower of Babel. Referring to the Tower of Babel is interesting because the old biblical story tells us that language was confused and the Tower of Babel was a very abrupt and hubris attempt by human beings to reach the heavens. But I think it always represented the pinnacle of civilization, because if you think about it, the Tower of Babel represents the fall of civilization and could refer to one of the great resets, which if you look at my theories of Tartaria and the Old World, I believe there have been several resets, and many other researchers believe that as well. It refers to the underground. People being moved underground is a recurring theory that we see in the Old World and Tartarian theories, and you also see it in many other societies, and even Native American tradition says that people went underground. Sometimes terrible things happened to them, other times it was to escape issues, but it is a recurring theme. Children being separated. Well, we also have the orphan trains and other aspects of how children were separated. We also have the reports of child labor from the 19th century. That's in this film. We have an actual flood and a reset. So they show the underground city being flooded when the workers sabotage the machines. Floods are always associated with resets, the Great Flood. So again, another reference to Tartaria and the Old World. Loss of humanity. People who are losing their humanity, whether they're becoming robots or they're acting like robots, or, as the film very much hits on the nose, building a robot and transferring the essence of a human being to that robot. Many different meanings, and that's also a theme that we see repeated in Tartaria and the Old World. Control of perceptions in time, going back to the time paradox video on this channel, but also in other aspects. You can see what it means. Trinity, balance, and hope. We see that the actual solution to the plot issues revolve people working together, talking, seeing past their differences, and the imagery does support that. There's always that concept of Trinity, and it comes up in many different aspects of society, religion, something that goes beyond the duality that we seem so obsessed with. Finally, this could be something from another time or place. The imagery and the aspects of the film are just remarkable. There are clues in this film that this is our story, not history. I believe that what's depicted in this film is important and it does matter. It's important to ensuring that you remain your own person, because there's a saying, it's better to be your own person than a fool in someone else's reality. Thank you for joining me. Ask questions, explore your existence. You'll restore the world. Please like, comment, and subscribe.